This is Dulcie, and this is Chronopolitics, and I'm going to be reading Investigations of a Dog by Franz Kafka. Are you lying comfortably? Then I'll begin. How much my life has changed, and yet how unchanged it has remained at the bottom. When I think back and recall the time I was still a member of the canine community, sharing all its preoccupations, a dog among dogs, I find on closer examination that from the very beginning I sensed some discrepancy, some little maladjustment causing a slight feeling of discomfort, which not even the most decorous public feeling of function could eliminate. More that sometimes, no, not sometimes, but very often, the mere look of some fellow dog of my own circle that I was fond of, the mere look of him, as if I'd just caught it for the first time, would fill me with helpless embarrassment and fear, even with despair. I tried to quiet my apprehensions as best I could. Friends to whom I divulged them helped me. More peaceful times came. Times, it is true, in which these sudden surprises were not lacking, but in which they were accepted with more philosophy, fitted into my life with more philosophy, inducing a certain melancholy and lethargy, it may be, but nevertheless allowing me to carry on as a somewhat cold, reserved and shy and calculating, but all the times considered normal enough dog. How indeed, big sigh, how indeed, without these intervals of convalescence, could I have reached the age that I presently enjoy? How could I have fought my way through to the serenity with which I contemplate the terrors of youth and endure the terrors of age? How could I have come to the point where I am able to draw the consequences of my admittedly unhappy, or to put it more moderately, not very happy position, and live almost entirely in accordance with them? Solitary and withdrawn, with nothing to occupy me save my hopeless, but, as far as I am concerned, indispensable little investigations. That is how I live. Yet, in my distant isolation, I have not lost sight of my people. News often penetrates to me, and now and then I even let news of myself reach them. The others treat me with respect, but do not understand my way of life. Yet they bear no grudge. And even young dogs, whom I sometimes see passing in the distance, a new generation of whose childhood I have only a vague memory, do not deny me a reverential greeting. For it must not be assumed that, for all my peculiarities which lie open to the day, I am in the least exempt from the laws of my species. Indeed, when I reflect on it, and I have time and disposition and capacity enough for that, I see that dogdom is in every way a marvellous institution. Apart from us dogs, there are all sorts of creatures in the world, wretched, limited, dumb creatures who have no language but mechanical cries. Many of us dogs study them, having given them names, try to help them, educate them, uplift them, and so on. For my part, I am quite indifferent to them, except when they try to disturb me. I confuse them with one another. I ignore them. But one thing is obvious. One thing is too obvious to escape me, namely, how little inclined they are, compared to us dogs, to stick together, how silently and unfamiliarly, and with what a curious hostility they pass each other by, How mean are the interests that suffice to bind them together for a little in ostensible union, and how often these very interests give rise to hatred and conflict. Consider us dogs, on the other hand. One can safely say that we live together in a literal heap, all of us, different as we are from one another, on account of numberless and profound modifications which have arisen in the course of time. All in one heap, we are drawn to each other, and nothing can prevent us from satisfying that communal impulse. All our laws and institutions, the few that I still know, and the many that I have forgotten, go back to this longing for the greatest bliss we are capable of, the warm comfort of being together. But now consider the other side of the picture. No creature, to my knowledge, lives in such wide dispersions as we dogs. None have so many distinctions of class, of kind, of occupation, distinctions too numerous to review at a glance. We, whose one desire is to stick together, and again we succeed at transcendent moments in spite of everything. We, above all others, are compelled to live separated from one another by strange vocations that are often incomprehensible, even to our canine neighbours, holding firm to the laws that are not of the dog world, but are actually directed against it. How baffling these questions are. Questions on which one would prefer not to touch. I understand that standpoint too, even better than my own. And yet questions to which I have completely capitulated. Why do I not, as the others, live in harmony with my people, and accept in silence whatever disturbs that harmony, ignoring it as small error in the great account, always keeping in mind the things that bind us happily together, and not those that drive us again and again, although by sheer force, out of our social circle. Are you camera shy? Is that it? I can recall an incident in my youth. I was at the time in one of those inexplicable, blissful states of exaltation which everyone must have experienced as a child. I was still quite a puppy, and everything pleased me. Everything was my concern. I believed that great things were going on around me, of which I was the leader, and to which I must lend my voice. Things which must be wretchedly thrown aside if I did not run for them and wag my tail for them. Childish fantasies that fled with riper years. But at the time, their power was great. I was completely under their spell. And, presently, something actually did happen. Something so extraordinary that it seemed to justify my wild expectations. In itself, it was nothing very extraordinary, for I have seen many such things, and many remarkable things too. Often enough since, but at the time it struck me with all the force of a first impression. One of those impressions which never can be erased, and influence much of one's later conduct. I encountered, in short, a little company of dogs. Or rather, I did not encounter them. They appeared before me. Before that, I had been running along in darkness for some time, filled with premonition of great things. A premonition that may well have been delusive, for I always had it. I had run in darkness for a long time, up and down, blind and deaf to everything, led on by nothing but a vague desire. And now I suddenly came to a stop, with the feeling that I was in the right place, and looking up, saw that it was a bright day, only a little hazy, and everywhere a blending and confusion of the most intoxicating smells. I greeted the morning with an uncertain barking, when, as if I had conjured them up out of some place of darkness to the accompaniment of terrible sounds such as I had never heard before, 7 dogs stepped into the light. Had I not distinctly seen that they were dogs, and that they themselves brought the sound with them, though I could not recognize how they produced it, I would have run away at once. But as it was, I stayed. At that time, I still knew hardly anything of the creative gift for music with which the canine race alone is endowed. It had naturally escaped me, but slowly developing powers of observation. For though music had surrounded me as a perfectly natural and indispensable element of existence ever since I was a suckling, an element which nothing impelled me to distinguish from the rest of existence, my elders had drawn my attention to it only by such hints as were suitable for childish understanding. All the more astonishing then, indeed devastating, were these 7 great musical artists to me. They did not speak, they did not sing, they remained, all of them, silent, almost determinedly silent. But from the empty air they conjured music. Everything was music. The lifting and setting down of their feet, certain turns of their head, their running and their standing still, the position they took up in relation to one another, the symmetrical patterns which they produced by one dog setting his front paws on the back of another, and the rest following suit until the first bore the weight of the other 6, or lying flat on the ground and then crawling through complicated concerted evolutions, and none made a false move, not even the last dog, though he was a little unsure. He did not always establish contact at once with the others, sometimes hesitated, as it were, on the stroke of a beat, but yet was unsure only by comparison with the superb sureness of the others. And even if he had been more unsure, indeed quite unsure, would not have been able to do any harm. The others, great masters all of them, keeping the rhythm so unshakably. But it is too much to say that I saw them clearly, that I actually even saw them. They appeared from somewhere. I inwardly greeted them as dogs. And although I was profoundly confused by the sounds that accompanied them, yet they were dogs nevertheless. Dogs like you and me. I regarded them by the simple force of habit, simply as dogs I had happened to meet on my road, and I felt a wish to approach them and exchange greetings. And they were quite near too, dogs much older than me, certainly, and not of my woolly, long-haired kind, but yet not so very alien in size and shape, indeed quite familiar to me. For I had already seen many such or similar dogs. But whilst I was still involved in these reflections, the music insensibly got the upper hand, literally knocked the breath out of me and swept me far away from those actual little dogs, and quite against my will, while I howled as if some pain were being inflicted on me. My mind could attend to nothing but this blast of music, which seemed to come from all sides, from the heights, from the depths, from everywhere, seizing the listener by the middle, overwhelming him, crushing him, and over his swooning body still blowing fanfares, so near that they seemed far away and almost inaudible. And then a respite came. for one was already too exhausted, too annulled, too feeble to listen any longer, a respite came, and I beheld again the 7 little dogs carrying out their evolutions, making their leaps. I longed to shout to them in spite of their aloofness, to beg them to enlighten me, to ask them what they were doing. I was a child, and I believed I could ask anybody about anything. But hardly had I begun, hardly did I feel on good and familiar doggish terms with the 7, when the music started again, robbed me of my wits, whirled me round in circles, and, as if I myself were one of the musicians, instead of being one of their victims, cast me hither and thither, no matter how much I begged for mercy, and finally rescued me from its own violence by driving me into a labyrinth of wooden bars which rose round that place, though I had not noticed it before, but which now firmly caught me, kept my head pressed against to the ground, and though the music still resounded in the open space behind me, gave me a little time to get my breath back. I must admit, I was less surprised by the artistry of the 7 dogs. It was quite incomprehensible to me, and also quite definite beyond my capacities, than by their courage in facing so openly the music of their own making, and their power to endure it calmly without collapsing. But now, from my hiding place, I saw, on looking more closely, that it was not so much coolness as the extreme tension that characterized their performance. These limbs, apparently so sure in their movement, quivered at every step with a perpetual apprehensive twitching, as if rigid with despair. The dog kept their eyes fixed on one another, and their tongues, whenever the tension weakened for a moment, hung wearily from their jowls. Just like that. It could not be a fear of failure that agitated them so deeply. Dogs that dare and achieve such things have no need to fear. Then why were they afraid? Who then forced them to do what they were doing? And I could no longer restrain myself, particularly as they now seemed in some incomprehensible way in need of help, and so thoroughly all in the din of the music. I shouted out my question loudly and challengingly, but they, oh incredible, incredible, they never replied, and behaved as if I was not there. Dogs who make no reply to the greeting of other dogs are guilty of an offence against good manners which the humblest dog would never pardon any more than the greatest. Perhaps they were not dogs at all. But how should they not be dogs? Could I not actually hear, on listening more closely, the subdued cries with which they encouraged each other, drew each other's attention to difficulties, warned each other against errors? Could I not see that the last and youngest dog, to whom most of these cries were addressed, often stealing a glance at me, as if he would not have dearly wished to reply, but refrained because it was not allowed? Is that what it is? Is it because he's not allowed to reply to me? Dulcie, is that why? You're ignoring me now. I'm telling you a frightening story. That's what we need. We need Kafka biscuits.
Let's have a little lie down. We'll say lie down.
Let's put them there.
Here we go. There we go.
Yeah. That's good. Little mid short story snack there.
Do you know this story?
No.
Yeah, I've never heard it before either.
No. So I've had to read Kafka in lectures before. Could I not see that the last and youngest dog, to whom most of these cries were addressed, often stealing a glance at me as if he would have dearly wished to reply, but refrained because he was not allowed? But why should it not be allowed? Why should the very thing which our laws unconditionally command not be allowed in this case? I became indignant at the thought and almost forgot the music. Those dogs were violating the law. Great magicians they might be, but the law was valid for them too. And I knew quite well that I was a child. And having recognised that I now noticed something else, they had good grounds for remaining silent. That is, assuming they remained silent from a sense of shame. For how were they conducting themselves? Because of all the music, I had not noticed it before, but they had flung away all shame. The wretched creatures were doing the very thing which is the most ridiculous and indecent in our eyes. They were walking on their hind legs. Fie on them. They were uncovering their nakedness, blatantly making a show of their nakedness. They were doing that as though they were a meritorious act. And when, obeying their better instincts for a moment, they happened to let their front paws fall, as if they were literally appalled, as if at an error, as if nature were an error, hastily raised their legs again, and their eyes seemed to beg forgiveness for having been forced to cease momentarily from their abomination. Was the world standing on its head? Where could I be? What could have happened? If only for my own sake I dared not hesitate any longer. I dislodged myself from the tangle of bars, took one leap into the open and made towards the dogs. I, the youngest scholar, must be the teacher now, must make them understand what they were doing and keep them from committing further sin. And old dogs too, and old dogs too, I kept on saying to myself. But scarcely was I free, and only a leap or two away from the dogs, when the music again had me in its power. Perhaps, in my ardour, I might have even managed to withstand it, for I knew it better now. If in the midst of all the majestic amplitude which was terrifying, but still not conquerable, a clear, piercing, continuous note which came without variation, literally from the remotest distance, perhaps the real melody in the midst of music, had not now rung out, forcing me to my knees. Oh, the music these dogs made almost drove me out of my senses. I could not move a step further. I no longer wanted to instruct them. You get that, insect? They could go on raising their front legs, committing sin and seducing others to the sin of silently regarding them. I was such a young dog. Who could demand such a difficult task from me? I made myself still more insignificant than I was. I whimpered, and if the dogs had asked me what I thought of their performance, probably I would not have a word to say against it. Besides, it was not long before the dogs vanished with all their music and their radiance into the darkness from which they had emerged. As I've already said, this whole episode contains nothing much of note. In the course of a long life, one encounters all sorts of things which, taken out from their context and seen through the eyes of a child, may well seem far less astonishing. Besides, one may, of course, in the pungent popular phrase, have got it all wrong, as well as everything connected with it. Then it could be demonstrated that this was simply a case where 7 musicians had assembled to practice their art in the morning stillness, and that a very young dog had strayed to the place, a burdensome intruder whom they tried to drive away. You okay there? Do you want a little hand? What is it?
Cleaning up.
Is it? Okay. I think there was an insect kind of flying around, bugging. Is that? I'll continue. Where was I? I could have got it all wrong, as well as everything connected with it. Then it could be demonstrated that this was simply a case where several musicians had assembled to practice their art in the morning stillness, that a very young dog had strayed to the place, a burdensome intruder who they tried to drive away by particularly terrifying or lofty music, unfortunately without success. He pestered them with his questions. Were they already disturbed enough by the mere presence of the stranger to be expected to attend to his distracting interruptions, as well as to make them worse by responding to them? Even the law commands us to reply to everybody. Was such a tiny stray dog, in truth, as somebody worth regarding? And perhaps they did not even understand him, for likely enough he barked his questions very indistinctly. Or perhaps they did not understand him, and with great self-control answered his questions, but he, a mere puppy unaccustomed to music, could not distinguish the answer from the music. As for walking on their hind legs, perhaps, unlike other dogs, they actually use these for walking. If it was a sin, well, it was a sin. But they were alone, 7 friends together, an intimate gathering within their own 4 walls, so to speak, quite private, so to speak, for one's friends, after all, are not the public, and where the public is not present, an inquisitive little street dog is certainly not capable of constituting it. But granting this, is it not as if nothing at all had happened? It is not quite so, but very nearly so. And parents should not let their children run about so freely, and had better teach them to hold their tongues and respect the aged. If all this is admitted, then it disposes of the whole case. But many things that are disposed of in the minds of grown-ups are not yet settled in the minds of the young. I rushed about, told my story, asked questions, made accusations and investigations, tried to drag others to the place where all this had happened, and burned to show everyone where I had stood, and where the 7 had stood, and where and how they had danced and made their music. And if anyone had come with me, instead of shaking me off and laughing at me, I would have probably sacrificed my innocence and tried to stand on my hind legs so as to reconstruct the scene clearly. Now, children are blamed for all they do, but also, in the last resort, forgiven for all they do. And I have preserved my childish qualities, and in spite of that, I've grown up to be an old dog. Well, just at that time, I kept on unceasingly discussing the foregoing incident, which today I must confess I lay far less importance on, analysing it into its constituent parts, arguing it with my listeners without regard to the company I found myself in, devoting my whole time to the problem, which I found as wearisome as everyone, but which, that was the difference. For that very reason, I was resolved to pursue indefatigably, I can never say that word, until I solved it, so that I might be left free to regain the ordinary, calm, happy life of every day. Just so have I, though with less childish means, and yet the difference is not so very great, laboured in the years since, and I go on labouring today. But it began with that concert. I don't blame the concert, as it's my innate disposition that has driven me on, and it would have certainly found some other opportunity of coming into connection had the concert never taken place. Yet the fact that it happened so soon used to make me feel sorry for myself. It robbed me of a great part of my childhood, the blissful life of the young dog, which can spin out for years. In my case, it lasted only a few short months. So be it. There are more important things than childhood, and perhaps I have the prospect of far more childish happiness earned by a life of hard work in my old age than any actual child would have had the strength to bear, but which then I shall possess. I began my inquiries with the simplest things. There was no lack of material. It is the actual superabundance, unfortunately, that cast me into despair in my darker hours. I began to inquire into the questions. What the canine race nourished itself upon? Now that, if you like, is by no means a simple question, of course. It has occupied us since the dawn of time. It is the chief object of our meditation. Countless observations and essays and views on this subject have been published, and it has grown into a province of knowledge, which in its prodigious compass is not only beyond the comprehension of any single scholar, but of all our scholars collectively, a burden which cannot be borne except by the whole of the dog community, and even then not without difficulty, and only in part, for it ever and again crumbles away like the neglected ancestral inheritance, and must laboriously be rehabilitated anew. Not to speak of all the difficulties and almost unfulfillable conditions of my investigation. No one need point all this out to me. I know it all as well as any average sensible dog can do. I have no ambition to meddle with real scientific matters. I have all the respect for knowledge that it deserves, but to increase knowledge I lack the equipment, the diligence, the leisure, and not least, and particularly during the past few years, the desire as well. I swallow down my food, but the slightly preliminary, methodical, politico-economical observation of it does not seem to me worthwhile. In this connection, the essence of all knowledge is enough for me. The simple rule with which the mother weans her young ones from her teats and sends them out into the world. Water the ground as much as you can. And is not almost everything contained in that? What scientific inquiry, ever since our first fathers inaugurated it, of decisive importance to add to it? Mere details, and how uncertain they are. But this one rule will remain as long as we are dogs. It concerns our staple food. True, we have also other resources, but only at a pinch. And if the year is not too bad, we could live on this staple food. We find it in the earth, but the earth needs our water to nourish it, but only at the price, and only at that price provides us with food. The emergence of which, however, and this should not be forgotten, can also be hastened by certain songs, spells, and ritual movements. But in my opinion, that is all. There is nothing else that is fundamental to be said on the question. In this opinion, moreover, I am at one with the vast majority of the dog community. I must firmly dissociate myself from all heretical views on this point. Quite honestly, I have no ambition to be peculiar or to pose as being in the right against the majority. I am only too happy when I can agree with my comrades, as I do in this case. My own inquiries, however, are in another direction. My personal observations tell me that the earth, when it is watered and scratched accordingly to the rules of science, extrudes nourishment, and moreover in such quality and in such abundance, in such ways, in such places, at such hours, as the laws partially or completely established by science demand. I accept all this. My question, however, is the following. Whence does the earth procure this food? A question which people in general pretend not to understand, and to which the best answer they can give is, if you haven't enough to eat, we'll give you some of ours. Now, consider this answer. I know that it is not one of the virtues of dogdom to share with others food that one has once gained possession of. Life is hard, the earth stubborn, science rich in knowledge, but poor in practical results. Anyone who has food keeps it for himself. That is not selfishness, but the opposite, dog law, the unanimous decision of the people, the outcome of their victory over egoism, for the possessors are always in a minority. And for that reason, this answer, if you haven't enough to eat, we'll give you some of ours, is merely a way of speaking, a jest, a form of raillery. I have not forgotten that. But all the more significant did it seem to me, when I was rushing about everywhere with my questions during those days, that they put the jest aside as far as I was concerned. True, they did not actually give me anything to eat. Where could they have found it at a moment's notice? And even if anyone chanced to have some food, naturally he forgot everything else in the fury of his hunger. Yet they all seriously meant what they said when they made the offer, and here and there, right enough, I was presently allowed some slight trifle, if I was only smart enough to snatch it quickly. How came it that people treated me so strangely, pampered me, favoured me? Because I was a lean dog, badly fed and neglected of my needs? But there were countless badly fed dogs running about, and all the others snatched even the wretchedest scrap from under their noses whenever they could, and not often from greed, but generally on principle. No, they treated me with special favour. I cannot give much detailed proof of this, but I have a firm conviction that it was so. Was it my questions then that pleased them, that they regarded as so clever? No, my questions did not please them, and generally were looked upon as stupid. And yet it could have only been my questions that won me their attention. It was as if they would rather do the impossible, that is, stop my mouth with food. They did not do it, but they would have liked to do it, rather than endure my questions. But in that case, they would have done better to drive me away, and refuse to listen to my questions. No, they did not want to do that. They did not indeed want to listen to my questions, but it was because I asked them questions that they didn't want to drive me away. That was the time, much as I was ridiculed and treated as a silly puppy, and pushed here and pushed there, the time when I actually enjoyed most public esteem. Never again was I to enjoy anything like it. I had free entry everywhere, no obstacle was put in my way. I was actually flattered, though the flattery was disguised as rudeness. And all really because of my questions, my impatience, my thirst for knowledge. Did they want to lull me to sleep, to divert me without violence, almost lovingly, from a path that was false, yet not so completely false that violence was permissible? Also, a certain respect and fear kept them from employing violence. I divined even in those days something of this. Today I know it quite well, far better than those who actually practiced it at the time. What they wanted to do was really divert me from my path. They did not succeed. They achieved the opposite. My vigilance was sharpened. More, it became clear to me that it was I who was trying to seduce the others, and that I was actually successful up to a certain point. Only with the assistance of the whole dog world could I begin to understand my questions. For instance, when I asked, "Whence does the earth procure this food?" I was troubled, as appearances might well indicate about the earth. Was I troubled about the labours of the earth? Not in the least. But as soon as I was recognised that, as I very soon recognised, was far from my mind. All that I cared for was the race of dogs, that and nothing else. For what is there actually except our own species? To whom else can one appeal in the wide and empty world? All knowledge, the totality of all questions and all answers, is contained in the dog. If one could realise this knowledge, if one could but bring it to the light of day, if we dogs would but own that we know infinitely more than we admit to ourselves. Even the most loquacious dog is more secretive of his knowledge than of the place where good food can be found. Trembling with desire, whipping yourself with your own tail, you steal cautiously upon your fellow dog. You ask, you beg, you howl, you bite, and achieve what you could have achieved just as well without any effort. Amiable attention, friendly contiguity, honest acceptance, ardent embraces, barks that mingle as one. Everything is directed towards achieving an ecstasy, a forgetting, and a finding again. But the one thing that you long to win above all, the admission of knowledge, remains denied to you. To such prayers, whether silent or loud, the only answer you get, even if after you've employed your powers of seduction to the utmost, are vacant stares, averted glances, troubled and veiled eyes. It is much the same as it was when, a mere puppy, I shouted to the dog musicians, and they remained silent. Now one might say, you tortured yourself because of your fellow dogs, because of their silence on crucial questions. You assert that they know more than they admit, more than they will allow to be valid, and that this silence, the mysterious reason for which is also, of course, tacitly concealed, poisons existence and makes it unendurable for us. So that now you must either alter it or have done with it. That may be. But you are yourself a dog. You have also the dog knowledge. Well, bring it out, not merely in the form of a question, but as an answer. If you utter it, who will think of opposing you? The great choir of dogdom will join in, as if it had been waiting for you. Then you will have clarity, truth, avowal, as much of them as you desire. The roof of this wretched life, of which you say so many hard things, will burst open, and all of us, shoulder to shoulder, will ascend to the lofty realm of freedom. And if we should not achieve that final consummation, if things should become worse than before, if the whole truth should be more unsupportable than the half, if it should be proved that the silent are in the right as the guardians of existence, if the faint hope that we still possess should give way to complete hopelessness, the attempt is still worth the trial, since you do not desire to live as you are compelled to live. Well then, why do you make it as a reproach against the others that they are silent and remain silent yourself? Easy to answer. Because I am a dog, in essentials just as locked in silence as the others, stubbornly resisting my own questions, dour out of fear. To be precise, it is in the hope that they might answer me that I have questioned my fellow dogs, at least since my adult years. Have I any such foolish hope? Can I contemplate the foundations of our existence, divine their profundity, watch the labour of their construction, that dark labour, and expect all this to be forsaken, neglected, undone, simply because I ask a question. No, that I truly expect no longer. I understand my fellow dogs, and flesh of their flesh, of their miserable, ever-renewed, ever-desirous flesh. Yet it is not merely flesh and blood that we have in common, but knowledge also. Not only knowledge, but the key to it as well. I do not possess that key except in common with all the others. I cannot grasp it without their help. The hardest bones containing the richest marrow can be conquered only by a united crunching of all the teeth of all dogs. That, of course, is only a figure of speech and exaggerated. If all teeth were but ready, they would not even need to bite. The bones would crack themselves, and the marrow would be freely accessible to the feeblest of dogs. If I remain faithful to this metaphor, then the goal of my aims, my questions, my inquiries appear monstrous. It is true. For if I want to compel all dogs thus to assemble together, I want the bones to crack open under the pressure of this collective preparedness, and then I want to dismiss them to the ordinary life that they love, while all by myself, quite alone, I lap up the marrow. That sounds monstrous. Almost as if I wanted to feed on all the marrow, not merely of a bone, but of the whole canine race itself. But it is only a metaphor. The marrow that I am discussing here is no food. On the contrary, it's a poison. My questions only serve as a goad to myself. If I want to be stimulated by the silence which rises up around me as the ultimate answer, how long will you be able to endure the fact that the world of dog, as your researchers make more and more evident, is pledged to silence and always will be? How long will you be able to endure it? That is the really great question of my life, before which all the smaller ones sink into insignificance. It is put to myself alone, and concerns no one else. Unfortunately, I can answer it more easily than the smaller, specific questions. I shall probably hold out till my natural end. The calm of old age will put up a greater and greater resistance to all my disturbing questions. I shall very likely die in silence, surrounded by silence, indeed almost peacefully. And I look forward to that with composure. An admirably strong heart, lungs that it's impossible to use up before their time, have been given to us dogs as if in malice. We survive all questions, even our own, bulwarks of silence that we are. Recently I've taken more and more to examining my life, looking for the decisive, the fundamental error that I must have surely have made. And I cannot find it. Yet I must have made it. For if I had not made it, and yet were unable by the diligent labour of a long life to achieve my desire, that would prove that my desire is impossible, and complete hopelessness must follow. Behold then, the work of a lifetime. First of all, my inquiries into the questions. Whence does the earth procure the food it gives us? A young dog, at bottom, naturally greedy for life, I renounced all enjoyments, apprehensively avoided all pleasure, buried my head between my front paws when I was confronted by temptation, and addressed myself to the task. I was no scholar, neither in the information I inquired, nor in the method, nor in the intention. That was probably a defect, but it could not have been a decisive one. I had had little schooling, for I left my mother's care at an early age, and soon got used to independence. I led a free life, and premature independence is inimical to systematic learning. But I've seen much, listened to much, spoken with dogs of all sorts and conditions, understood everything. I believe, fairly intelligently, and correlated with my particular observations fairly intelligently, that has compensated somewhat for my lack of scholarship, not to mention that independence. If it is a disadvantage in learning things, it is an actual advantage when one is making one's own inquiries. In my case, it was all more necessary, as I was not able to employ the real methods of science to avail myself, that is, of the labours of my predecessors, and establish contact with contemporary investigators. I was entirely cast on my own resources, began at the very beginning, and with the consciousness inspiring to youth, but utterly crushing to age, that the fortuitous point to which I carried my labours must also be the final one. Was I really so alone in my inquiries at the beginning and up to now? Yes, and no. It is inconceivable that there must not always have been, and that there are not today individual dogs in the same case as myself. I cannot be so accursed as that. I do not deviate from the dog nature by a hairbreadth. Every dog has, like me, the impulse to question, and I have, like every dog, the impulse not to answer. Everyone has the impulse to question. How otherwise could my questions have affected my hearers in the slightest? And they were often affected, to my ecstatic delight, an exaggerated delight, I must confess. And how otherwise could I have prevented from achieving much more than I have done? And that I have the compulsion to remain silent needs, unfortunately, no particular proof.